All right, so for my teacher interviews, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into my community, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where I teach in my school district. So I did an interview with a middle school history teacher and also with a high school French teacher. And then just to offer a little bit of contrast to the context where I teach, I also did a interview with a teacher at a public school in Brazil, in the city of Belo Horizonte, because I knew that the access to resources was much different, and thus the interaction with technology had to be much different as well. So I'll start with the middle school and the high school. So there are a lot of resources in this school district. So luckily, all students in the middle school are given an iPad that they're expected to use on a daily basis, bring to all of their classes, and really that's their mode of interaction with the teacher and also with the other students. So um, almost all activities are broadcasted on their iPads. So screens can be shared, collaboration can take place amongst other students and also amongst the teacher, and different activities, different online tools that the teacher uses, different games and things like that, all can be taken care of on that iPad. So it's really a centralized way in which almost all activities take place. Um, and then in the high school, it's pretty similar. All students are given a computer, a MacBook Air, and with that, they're expected to pretty much engage with that computer in every class that they go to. There's an online database called Canvas where all of their assignments, courses, modules, grades are held, so that's really their portal into the school. So they're expected to check that, multiple times a day, for different homeworks, different tests, to look at grades and things like that, look at comments from the teacher, collaborate. So that's a really, really important tool that they use. In the French class in particular, this teacher is really a fan of some online tools like Quizlet and Kahoot, where you can do different types of games where everyone can participate at the same time, especially working with vocabulary. So in the French class particularly, she talked about doing a lot of things hands-on and a lot of things without technology. So, creating stories, writing stories that actually come from the students themselves, reading stories, acting out plays and things like that actually get the students moving and speaking with each other, but then supplemented with all of these different online tools and games that usually happen at the end of class, just as a kind of a fun way to maintain some practice with new vocabulary. And then to completely contrast both of those realities, so I talked with a public school teacher in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and she painted a very different picture of the access to technology. So there, in many cases, even teachers don't have computers. In many classrooms, the highest level of technology is a projector. In her school in particular, there is a computer room, but there are thousands of students within the school in one computer room with maybe 10 computers. So obviously that does not provide a lot of access and a lot of comfortability and really in ability to engage with that technology. So still in this school, for example, and as I said, this is a public school. It's actually run by the state in Brazil. The resources are just not there to allow students to interact through technology on a daily basis like we would here in Jackson. So a lot of things, almost everything is still done by hand. Taking notes is still done by hand. Tests are all done by hand. And for the teachers, this one thing that she discussed with me is how time consuming that is and how useful it would be if there were different apps that could be used to streamline grading processes and things like that. And she said that she is able to use her phone in class, and use some apps that help with that, but there's no instruction from the administration itself giving expectations for this is the technology that you should be using. So I thought that was very interesting just to contrast, a very wealthy and resource heavy community like where I live and where I teach, with a completely different reality in Brazil, that still exists in 2020, but just has a completely different way of interacting with their students because of a lack of access to resources. And for the student surveys, so I actually run a soccer camp here in this town. So I had a good group of students that I had easy access to answer the survey. And the first question I asked was actually about what are the foods that you most commonly eat, because I thought that would be a kind of low intensity way of figuring out some cultural realities to that student, and maybe where the family comes from, based on what they eat. And that actually did um, prove to be true. There's a little bit of diversity in the camp, and there's a large Mexican population that plays in the camp, and so you can expect, what they were eating were things like more tortillas, more rice, more beans. And then the Caucasian players who are there, was a little bit different. So then I asked, what does an average Sunday look like for you, to see if there are any religious practices that the families interact with. Um, and I also asked what are your favorite apps that you use on your cell phone? And the top three or the top four were TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube. I did that just to see, what are they compatible with already, and thus how can that be used in the future in class. And then I ask a question on how much time do you spend, how much screen time do you have every day? And the majority of students responded with 5 to 9 hours per day, which is quite a lot. Which is quite a lot. Um, and then the last question I asked was just about virtual learning, and if there were any recommendations they would have for teachers to make virtual learning more successful for them. And for a lot of these students, the elementary and middle school, it was difficult for them to really offer any answers to that, offer any explanations, and critically think about, what is my experience, which I understand. But I'm glad that I asked that questions just to get them thinking about it a little bit. And then I was on ways to integrate technology to best support English language learners. One really interesting thing I found is something called a station rotation. So within the classroom, actually setting up 4 stations in which students can focus on 4 pillars of language learning, which is reading, listening, writing, and speaking. And then in each one of those stations, use technology to build on the learning for that module. So if depending on what the topic is, you could find a reading on that online. You could find someone talking about that topic, whether if you're talking about food, for example. So find a native speaker talking about different foods. Writing, so you can actually have the students themselves write based on what they just heard and try to rewrite what it is that they just heard. And then speaking, so at the end of the class, or kind of the culmination, would be actually have a conversation about it with the teacher, or in a group, and then come together in the end and have a discussion with the whole class. I thought that was a very interesting way to do it, because it allows you in one class period to go through the 4 different pillars of language learning, and change, in 15 or 20-minute sections from one step to the next, so that if a student is struggling with the reading, well, there's in 20 minutes there'll be a chance to be successful with listening. So it keeps it fresh, and it keeps the students engaged, even if they're struggling a little bit. And then with ways to integrate technology to best support special needs students. So a main thing is there are all these different learning apps that can be used with not only special education students, but all students. So finding different ways that students can engage with material through these different apps. With reading, for example, are there ways that if a student is having trouble actually reading on the screen, that it can be that they can listen to the audio instead of actually reading it, and maybe instead of speaking, they can type it, and then it can go into a from text to voice. So those technologies exist these days and are very accessible and can make a huge difference in the life of a special needs student. And then something else that's really important is, I think, just embracing failure and encouraging risk taking with tech. So with special needs students, with the research that I've done, it can be a little bit intimidating using these new apps and things like that. So really just encouraging students to be courageous and to do their best to learn step by step how to use them and to not be afraid of failure. And then not really associated with tech, but still a little bit, is just creating well-defined areas. So students have a really good idea of when you're in this location within the classroom, this is exactly what we expect of you. And then when you move to this location, this is what we expect. So those are things like a personal space, a group space, a sensory space where they can just interact with their surroundings, the teacher space that maybe is a private space, so students have that expectation that that is just the teacher's zone, and I need to respect that. And then lastly, just through conversation with the cohort, I think the biggest thing that I've learned is just the multitude of realities that we have in this world when it comes to the use of technology, and the access to technology. So if we're working in a district or in a school that has a lot of access to resources, then obviously the options are almost endless to what we can use. And then if you're in a school like what I previously discussed in Brazil, it really closes a lot of doors to the different things that you can do, which doesn't mean that you can't be creative to increase engagement, but it really means that you have to think very critically and think outside of the box to get those students really engaged, because there's just not the same resources that allows simply for students to just open up their computer and be right there in that online portal or whatever it is. So I think that's the biggest learning that I've got from this week, is just how being an educator, you have to understand all of these different realities and thus how to best use the resources that are at your disposal.